Well, that was great there in the first half, getting finally for you to have a chance to have your say on what you think the ego is, and with the go around with all the people here and on Zoom to have a little moment to hear how it's a growing, changing idea based on what we have been surveying so far with the different perspectives of the ego, looking at the Freudian, the Jungian, Osho, Rudolf Steiner. And I did want to start off actually just briefly looking at what we covered last week with the perspective of Rudolf Steiner and the slideshow that I created. Again, this is something that's available to you through the link that is there on the webpage, and I'll put it in the YouTube video thing as well so people can access all the slides that I'm presenting here for this class. So, yeah, what we looked at last week was the Western spiritual perspective as described by Rudolf Steiner, and how the ego is a central component of human spiritual development. Quite a radical departure from the Eastern spiritual perspective, and I emphasis on the ancient Eastern perspective because it is actually an older perspective. And now the ego represents the individual's core identity and unique spiritual self. The ego is distinct from the physical body, the life forces, or the etheric body, and emotions and desires, or the astral body, and is the part that is truly individualized and self-aware. The ego is both a gift and a responsibility, the source of individuality and freedom, yet also of selfish desires and isolation. So this double-edged sword. The ego has the potential to develop beyond ordinary self-awareness by engaging in spiritual practices, meditation, and self-discipline to cultivate a higher consciousness. Ego development is a progressive journey, an evolution of consciousness, evolving toward higher levels of self-awareness and spiritual insight. The ego plays a crucial role in this process. And I like how somebody contrasted the difference between the dissolving ego and the evolving ego. It's quite a different way to consider it. Dissolve it or evolve it. And lastly, the spiritual journey is for the ego to learn to transcend its lower impulses, integrate into the greater spiritual whole, and ultimately become a vessel for universal love and wisdom. We're seeing now, quite a different perspective, maybe refreshing. It seems like it's refreshing for some of you from what we heard in the circle to at least get some clarity and not be in the ambiguity and the confusion of what it is, or to be thinking it's a bad thing that we need to get rid of, but in fact that it's something to embrace, something to work with, something to accept as a gift as well as a responsibility. That in fact it is very much central to who we are and to the work on the modern spiritual journey. And again, I point to this book by Rudolf Steiner, How to Know the Higher Worlds, a Modern Path of Initiation. So we are introducing something that is modern, is new, and potentially unknown to a lot of people, especially people that may have steeped themselves in the older path, and the older Eastern path that predates the new Western light that has emerged in more recent times. So something I want to point to, which I like to bring up because one of the best questions I've ever had as a teacher and a spiritual psychotherapist is, what's the difference between Western psychology and Eastern psychology? And when we talk about psychology working with the mind and the ego, in Western psychology, they really don't know where this thing is. They have tried to figure out, where is the soul? Is it in the head? Is it in the heart? Is it in the left big toe? You know, so it really hasn't manifested as anything clear. What at best Western psychology can do is really just point to the functions, like it's functioning or it's not functioning. And where it exists, we don't really know, like in terms of its physical, as a physical entity. But this is where it gets interesting, and we can revert to Eastern ideas. I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater when we say that the older Eastern path, it's not of value. It is of value. And in some ways, we need to embrace certain aspects of that, particularly when it comes to asking where is the ego? What is his existence? And this is where we can move from just the idea of it being functional, having function, but also that it is corporeal, functional and corporeal. What do I mean by that? Corporeal means body, that it is, in fact, an entity, a body that has its own existence, not as a physical thing, but as a metaphysical thing. So, in the Eastern perspective, they do look at the human being as having these different bodies, sometimes referred to as the koshas or the sheaths, that, they are these different bodies, one nested within another. And that we're not just a physical atomic being, as within the Western scientific perspective, but we have a variety of corporeal natures that each have their different, distinct functional natures. So here we have a slide titled Comparison of Different Models. So, yeah, we were talking about the Western scientific that acknowledges we have a physical body, and within that, really, in a physical hormonal sense, we have these urges and the libido called the id. And then there is this ego that has its awareness of its urges and whatnot. And then above that is the superego or the overseer that, helps to give impulses to the ego, which it can mediate so that it can navigate its life on earth as a physical body. And really the goal in the Western scientific model is that you die contented. Whereas in other models, I've got the Eastern spiritual, the Western spiritual, and I've thrown in the ancient Egyptian because I've been studying that for a few years. And it is interesting to know how they viewed things. So, yeah, in the Eastern spiritual, they recognize, this is a physical body. They call it the Annamaya kosha. The kosha is a sheath. So Annamaya basically means the sheath that's made out of matter or made out of food. And, in the Western spiritual, we call the physical body. In the Egyptian, they called it the Ket. Then on the next level, in Eastern spiritual, there's this life force, which in the Vedic terms is the prana, and the Asian, it's the chi or the ki. In the Western spiritual, there's the etheric life body, and in Egypt, they called it the ka, the life force body. And we've been doing ka practices to engage and enliven this life force body, which helps to take care of the physical form. Then this is where the confusion sets in, because in the Eastern spiritual model, they have this next level, the ahamkara, which is an aspect of the mind, which they called manas. And it is this thing that asserts a sense of personal self, for better or worse. But really, in the Eastern spiritual way of being, as we know, there's been really more of a tendency towards a sublimation of self-expression, and deference rather to the higher power of the guru, and of God. So this was not considered really a beneficial part of the mind. But the problem is they, and I think this is a major, major, major problem, was when Eastern teachers started to come to North America and equated the Ahamkara with the Western idea of ego, which Freud and Jung never said that ego was a bad thing or that you needed to get rid of it. In their model, it's something to work with, to develop, that is very important. But somehow Eastern teachers, instead of using the term Ahamkara, they started saying, oh, that's the ego. The ego is bad. And our spirituality says you should dissolve it. You shouldn't have it. You should get rid of it. That it leads to attachment, which leads to suffering. So there's nothing good about the ego. So this was a major fork in the road in terms of our cultural understanding of the ego, when Eastern teachers co-opted this word that Freud got from the Greeks, the word ego, which simply means I, and it's actually pronounced ego in Greek, and they equated that with the Ahamkara, and that led to a whole load of confusion and mistrust in the ego, mistrust in ourselves, and really tripping people up on their spiritual path, as far as I'm concerned. But really, this thing of the manas, or the mind, equates, in the Western spiritual tradition, to the astral body, or what's known as the soul, that expresses a personality. And in the ancient Egyptian, they call it the Ba, or the soul body. And it is a body. This is not just something that's functional, it's something that's corporeal as well. Same with the Ka, the etheric body. It is a body. It's not just a function. It's not just something we can quantify, but there are people that develop sight, spiritual sight, that can actually see it. They can see its condition. They can see, its orientation to the physical body and whatnot. And this is really where the action is. This is really where the work is to be done. And you'll see why in a moment, because when we get to the next level in the Eastern spiritual tradition, the true self, or the Atman, is something that we seek to manifest, to grow into, to grow up into, but also to grow down into ourselves. When we grow up, we actually can grow it down. It's like things go in two directions. This bringing of the true self, the Atman in the Eastern spiritual tradition, down into the earth, to help with the earth and the transformation of the earth. And this is, in the Western spiritual tradition, really the ego, self, the I, our spiritual nature. It's our spiritual nature as opposed to our soul nature, which is a temporal personality. It's a temporal personality, whereas this could be considered eternal. And in the Eastern spiritual tradition, they believe in reincarnation, that this part keeps coming back for new experiences in different soul or personalities. But the reason it's doing that is because the ego, as I think it was Ping was saying, that it's about going from a lower state of being into a higher state of being, to grow it up into becoming a higher manifestation, which again is about growing something down into yourself. We grow up by growing something down. But this ego self, I, is not really the thing that's subject to diseases, which we're going to get into next week. The diseases are really what takes place here in the Ahamkara, or the astral nature, the personality. This is really the canvas upon which to work, is your personality. And I find this is so exciting that, within the Western spiritual tradition, that it's like, go, green light, develop yourself by developing your personality. And, a lot of people are fearful, they're timid, they're not sure how to express themselves. So they don't have personality, or they're just sheeple. They just follow the herd. And they have not really come into developing the quality of green, or quality of yellow, or quality of being high, or quality of being low, or quality of being hot, quality of being cool. These are all astral qualities from the palette of nature and the universe to work on this canvas of the personality, the soul, which is temporal and very mercurial. Your personality can change in many ways over the course of a lifetime. But this is where the problems arise, because, yeah, people can get inflated. They can get inflated, they get deflated. They can get messed around and lose themselves, and lose the grounding in which the ego self, the spiritual nature, is trying to work through to evolve itself as an eternal spiritual being. And in the tradition of the ancient Egyptians, they called this the khu. The khu is the spirit self that is evolving. And just to finish off here, the goals of each of this in the Eastern spiritual tradition is unity with Brahman, the ultimate reality, and get off the wheel of karma and reincarnation. In the Western tradition, it's to evolve to a higher maturity and spiritual connection. And it could be inclusive of also the Eastern, if you embrace the idea of reincarnation and karma, that, in Western spirit, and that's the way it was in Rudolf Steiner's view. He embraced a lot of Eastern teachings, including karma and reincarnation. He felt his job as a Western spiritual teacher was to bring these Eastern teachings in a new way and a new understanding to the West, for the Western modern mind. And then lastly here, the Egyptian, they are seeking to develop the Ak of the Khu, that the spiritual nature develops into an Ak when it can sustain consciousness beyond death, sustain consciousness even when you're asleep at night. And that's the real meaning of immortality. To be immortal is that your spiritual nature can sustain consciousness. Yes, questions?
Yeah. But from your model, it sounds like the big difference between Eastern spirituality and Western spirituality is that Eastern says that for us to evolve, we have to get rid of the ego, and by getting rid of, we uncover the true self. And Western is saying, no, it's not getting rid of the ego. It's like the spiritual part is a separate body. So you can evolve where you go to access the spiritual body, kind of thing. Is that the name?
Yeah, I don't know if in the Eastern there's even a sense of evolving something. Certainly there's a sense of self-mastery, but with the aim of dissolving back into the ocean of nothingness. And that would have fit within the more of the tribalistic, or to have this homogeneous sense. But yeah, it's obvious we're evolving as egos, and like that's very Western, and it's like that's the program now.
The Eastern thing is still really prevalent today. Like a lot of people I talk to still believe in this no ego as the path to enlightenment. To reach the next level, it's actually go to no ego.
I know, but I ask people, it's like, okay, you can say those words, but what is the experience of your reality? What's your subjective experience? Don't you find that there's something compelling you to have your own mind, have your own opinion, have your own vote, to debate things, to have skepticism, to exercise all these new functions that have evolved? Like, doesn't that seem obvious to you? Like, doesn't that seem kind of contradictory when you then go and spout these Eastern teachings? Let's do a little exercise here for a moment. I want you to take your finger, your pointer finger, and say, while pointing, say sailboat.
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 Sailboat. Sailboat.
Pointing where?
Well, hopefully at a sailboat.
Where's the sailboat?
Look around. There's two of them here.
No, I literally can't. I don't have good sight.
Oh, okay.
Both Jesse's.
There's a sailboat above my head here.
That sailboat.
Yeah.
Sailboat.
People might see it in the camera. There's a sailboat there. So, yeah, sailboat. Now keep that finger. Now say the word. Now you notice there's two sailboats you could have pointed at. Say the word I. And point. Point. I. Where do you point?
At the sailboat.
Okay. You are crazy. Okay.
I'm crazy.
Point being is that there's only one place you can point when you say I, in a general sense. That word I is unique to you. I say I. I would normally point at a sailboat and go I. I mean, if you want to get poetic.
Might.
Exactly. Babies do, because babies don't have an ego incarnated yet. So a baby references itself with the world outside of itself. A baby looks out and goes, that's all me. But as we grow up, this sense of self comes in, just as in the grand evolution of humanity, a sense of self has evolved in. More so now than in the Eastern perspective. We have more of a sense of self in the Western perspective than in the older Eastern perspective, because babies are actually living in a state of consciousness that's more in an older time period. But as they grow up, then it's like, no, me. Like by the time they're really, they go through this early stage in the twos where it's like I, me, mine, and they do have an awakening of their own sense of self, and then that kind of gets lost, and then it comes back again later in the teens and the 20s. All right, I'm going to get into the functions of the ego now, because we've been putting this off way too long, and this is going to be fun because I think now that we've come into some clarity, and not necessarily agreeing on everything, but at least a sense that this is something that's valid in our experience, we can proceed with some logic. We don't have to get, into anything too esoteric around this, but just, proceed through this logically, beginning with the function of identity. That, if you can say I and point at yourself, then you are identifying yourself. You are becoming self-aware. And, within that, you have identification of yourself in contrast to the other. So, yeah, I have a sense of identity. But this is where, the function has a lot of breadth. Because within the sense of identity, what do we identify with? If you are really of a Western scientific mindset where you feel that you are just a physical body, then that's your identity. And if you got a nice physical body, then like you feel good about yourself. And if you don't have a nice physical body, you don't feel good about yourself. But that's kind of a dumbed down state. And it really gets into trouble when it's like you start identifying with your body, you start identifying with your race, you identify with your skin color, you identify with your blood lineage, you identify with your looks. And so this, is something that I'm not saying that it's not of value, your race and gender orientation and things like that, like that's another physical thing. Half the people have a penis and the other half have a vagina. Like, okay, is that your level of identification? Well, that's a choice. If you want to level out at that part, it could cause problems, especially if you don't feel good about yourself physically, and you look into the mirror of the world and go, well, nobody's going to like that. I can't receive love. Or on the level of soul, level of personalities, like you identify with, oh, I've got nice hair, the way my hair is, or I've got a car, I bought a car, so people will look at me and think, oh, there's something, they got a car like that, or the amount of money you've got, your status. This is all really at the level of the soul, the Ba. Do you identify with that? Or your religion? That's kind of a soul thing, like, oh, I belong to this religious tribe, or my religion's better than that. We're more accurate in our interpretation of these ancient texts and whatnot. I mean, these sorts of things are causing problems in the world. Sure, there's a place for religion and spiritual teaching and whatnot, but if we identify who we are with these kind of clans and traditions, then yeah, there's separation. There's separation. And, I mean, this is one of the functions of the ego, is separation. And it is one of the functions of having a physical body, is to have a sense of separateness. Like, I am separate from Mario because, his body's sitting over there, my body's sitting there. And that actually helps me in my identification as an ego being, to go, oh, I'm a separate ego. I have a separate inner life. I have a separate way of, functioning as an ego being. And that's very obvious because, at the end of the class, he's going to go home to his physical house and I'm going to stay in my physical house. So there is value to the physical identification in as much as it helps us in our individuation as a spiritual being. An ego spiritual being having a physical existence. But this identification with things of the earth really can have a huge spiritual gravity when people polarize. And I saw this in Egypt when I was there the first time, and I was in a Bedouin camp hanging out with a lot of cool people, and the war broke out between Israel and Gaza. And there was actually some cool people there from Israel vacationing in Egypt, and they referred to it as Israel-Palestine. They just called it one thing, Israel-Palestine. It's all one. So their identification was not as being Israeli, but being part of something larger than that. But there was still a lot of identification with Egyptians and Israelis with, whose side am I on? And I found that I was telling them about my interest in pyramids, because for me, pyramids are pointing up to the cosmos and to our cosmic origins. That I identify not as a Canadian, not as a male, not as white, but born of the cosmos, because everything is born of the cosmos. We're all born of the cosmos. The earth is born of the cosmos. Everything has its origin in the cosmos. And so we can choose as an ego being to identify as a cosmic being rather than so much of an earthly being with, this racial, religious orientation. To me, that's the only solution to these wars and this bloodshed on the earth, is to shift our ego's identification a little bit away from its earthly orientation to something that's more universal, and realize we're here to learn to love and share the land. So, yeah, that's the first function. And I'm just giving a bit of an example there on how identification can work in a positive way, or it can go south. And within that, I'll just repeat about how, we are artists of ourselves. You don't have to be fixated in how you identify. We have this creative nature within us to create, self-create, and to transform. All right, so we have a sense of self, and then concomitant with that is out of their ego, we can have a sense of the other. This is the fantastic thing. The function of the ego is that it can move beyond itself and then come back to itself. And this is the function of empathy. Empathy is such an important capacity to develop, and we'll be doing that in the course on focusing coming up in the winter. Developing empathy where we can really step into another person's experience. That as an ego being, I can actually experience what your ego feels and what it's going through, see through your eyes, but then come back to my own experience and go, oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're seeing. I may not even agree with it, but at least I can see it. This is part of the ability to identify with ourselves, identify with other people's experiences, and this capacity for empathy to really sense the other. And that's not only with people, but to return to the shamanic, the older shamanic practices where you merged with things. In the shamanistic mindset, they could actually merge with things in the world, with nature, and be one with it. And these things could teach them through this merging with one another. We don't have that so much now because of the development of the left brain egoistic mindset. Now there's more separation. It's hard to merge. So instead of letting things teach us in science, we tell them what they are. We name them and say, well, that's what that is, rather than letting it teach us what it is. But this is where the neo-shamanistic mindset that we need to grow will allow us to then, again, enter into the world, merge with it, get information from it, but at the same time have this scientific side that can now analyze things and come to a complete understanding, holistic understanding of things. So following on this thing about the sense of the other, the ego also has the function of a boundary setter. You have that option to maintain a distinction between yourself and the other. In the older ancient mindset, you were naturally merged. We're not naturally merged. And thank God, like we can say, okay, I set a boundary between myself and you, a time boundary, a space boundary, and so forth. This is, this is one of the functions, because we have our own little turf to work with. We have our personal turf here. You could even say it's our own personal promised land to have and to work with and to develop. Following on that is the function as freedom fighter. Sometimes you have to fight for your own piece of land. Set up boundaries and say, no, this is mine to steward, to take care of. This is, what's been given to me, and I have responsibility for this. So we have to fight to maintain our boundaries and fight to develop our own thoughts, our own opinions, our own impulses, distinct from, super egos of parents or government or religion or corrupt and institutionalized powers that, try to impose upon our freedom. A freedom fighter is something inherent in this ego nature. And you see that in people when the fire wells up, and they begin to rebel. You saw that a lot during the pandemic. It's like, government's not going to be my super ego. I'm going to make my own choices. And there was a lot of rebellion. Saw the rebellion come out in people that weren't normally rebellious, but, they had their own mind, their own thoughts. It was kind of healthy in that way, that everybody had have their own ideas around what was going on and what should be their appropriate course of action. Otherwise, we can fall into slavery. If we don't fight for freedom, we'll fall into slavery. And slavery has many different forms. It's still very much alive on the planet and really preys upon ignorance. This is why Jesus said to know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You really have to seek to know and develop your own consciousness, and that is what sets you free. Not just fighting mindlessly, but actually fighting for true knowledge. And because there are dark forces, in the world that are counter consciousness. That is their function. There is things that function in the world that are counter forces that want to put us into slavery. This is why Jung, he loved the book of Job. He read the book of Job. He wrote a book called The Answer to Job. This is one of the books in the Old Testament about the trials of Job, who was being tested by the devil. The devil came and he tested Job to see whether he really had true faith in God. And so you could say that in the Judeo-Islamic tradition, the devil is considered this dark counter-consciousness force that tries to sublimate our consciousness and our spiritual power and our faith and so forth, to see whether we, are really on the mark or not. So, in a sense, the devil is a real force. It is a real objective force. I'm a little disappointed in Deepak Chopra. I know he's very popular and he's inspired a lot of people, but he's a teacher who's teaching out of the older Eastern tradition. And I saw a quote by him. He's basically saying that the ego is the devil. And the ego made up this idea of the devil. So the ego could blame everything on somebody else. But it's really the ego that's at fault, and the ego is the devil. I don't know why he would say that, like he's reduced the devil down to just your ego. Your ego is the devil, rather than an objective force that works outside of us and inside of us to try and sublimate our consciousness and our spiritual power. And why he would do that, because in the Eastern tradition, they also have this idea of an objective force they call Maya. And in a sense, the Maya of the Hindu tradition is the devil of the Judeo-Christian tradition that preys upon the ego, but it is a distinct force. I would never equate the ego as the devil and that the ego just invented the devil. So, yeah, in order to really get to freedom, we have to know the truth about things. This is why, I'm emphasizing some of the more subtle points here. But the ego is the knower. That's its function, is the knower. And we've already looked at how it can know things subjectively. It can know things objectively. Some is more right brain cognitive activity. Some of it's more left brain cognitive activity. I have another slide along these lines here. Ego and knowing. Did a review that the ancient humans with little ego presence had a natural knowing as a subject that was merged with the objective world. The ego has grown and evolved capacities for itself with the transition to left brain cognitive activities. So there's this evolution of ego. The ego experiences a sense of separateness and skepticism as a way of knowing. That's the left brain scientific ego-based knowing. It's through separateness and skepticism. And because of that, the ego has actually ushered in the rise of science. And the word science from the Greek actually means to know. Science is just about knowing. Now, ego has freedom as a self-aware ego being to merge with and to analyze the objective world through more of a neo-shamanistic or a new shamanistic mechanism within us. And in doing this, it's exercising conscious, willing choice. Or not. That's the beauty of it. We don't have to exercise conscious, willing choice. We can forego that as free beings. So, yeah, the ego as the knower. And then within that, it's also the builder of itself. And I just want to talk about how that works, how the ego can build itself. It's actually through the information that comes from experience. That the ego as a corporeal body builds itself the way your physical body builds itself by having an experience and then digesting the experience, assimilating the information out of the experience, eliminating the irrelevant aspects of the experience, and edifying itself with the knowledge that comes, that is integrated into itself as a corporeal being. So you're actually building your ego along parallel lines to the way your physical body builds yourself. Somebody was saying earlier, they were talking about symbols and how the body is a symbol. It is a symbol. It's a metaphor for how we build our spirit. Through experiences in the physical world, we then reflect upon those experiences, digest them, assimilate what's relevant, and eliminate what's not relevant, and integrate it in the building of ourselves as knowing beings that then can actually develop wisdom and power. Alchemists?
Alchemizing.
Alchemizing it, yes. That's another way to put it. Alchemizing. This is beautiful in its simplicity on how to evolve the ego in a healthy way rather than dissolve it. And to help with this, I'm just going to insert the home play for the week, which is another exercise from Rudolf Steiner that's coming out, this newer path of initiation, the Western spiritual perspective of things. An exercise he called the Rückschau, which is a German word that means backward review. To do a backward review of your day. Towards the end of the day, when you're not too tired because you don't want to fall asleep doing this, and it only takes 5 minutes. You can go longer if you want, but you don't need to go too long. As you sit, you close your eyes because you want to picture. You want to use your mental picturing capacity. It's not journal writing, but to visualize, okay, what was the thing I just did before I sat down? And then before that, what did I do? Where was I before that? Who did I see? What was said? What do I remember of what was in the room? Picture it as clearly as you can. And then just keep continuing back through the day. You know, you can move fairly quickly, or you might come to a hot spot in your day. And it's like, oh, I want to digest this a bit more, this experience, because it really speaks to you. It wakes something up. It's like, oh, I think there's some meaning and message in this event. So be with that and continue, if you can, right to the beginning of the day when you woke up. You might even be able to remember dreams that you had. So, you know, as I said, you can make it longer if you want, because you might find that there's some really juicy things with some meat on the bone that you can build and edify yourself with. As I was saying, you build yourself, you evolve your ego out of the information of experiences. And that word information. You inform yourself with information. You're forming your insides with information coming from the experiences you're having as a spiritual being in the physical world. And one other point I'll add, you know, is you're trying to see yourself, somewhat objectively. okay, there was Jesse. He was, having breakfast with some friends, and friend was talking, and oh, the friend got kind of heated about what I said. Okay, why was he getting heated about what I said? Then I start to think about what I said. So I'm looking at myself objectively, and what does that do? It puts you into a higher place. You're looking down on yourself, so you're actually evolving your ego into its higher aspect, the higher self, the higher ego, by looking at yourself objectively. And this is some of the power and beauty of the scientific side that we have, that now can even create separateness with yourself. I can separate it from myself and look at my personality objectively and learn from it and grow. I tell people in my classes, this is the one exercise you should do every day for the rest of your life. So if you're doing it every day for the rest of your life, you'll find there's a lot of variety, that you're guided intuitively. Maybe you go immediately to some point in the day, it's like, oh, this is the point I really need to digest, and you stay there for 5 minutes. But the general idea is to go backwards, and there's a reason why you go backwards, because it gets your mind out of its usual forward moving linear way of thinking. It kind of goes against the grain, which awakens certain capacities. So be sure to go backwards. But if you find that your mind is drawn to a particular point in the day, then go with it. The next function of the ego is as chooser. Choices. Wow. You have choice? Think about that. You have choice? Maybe you're kind of asleep to that fact. There's lots of choices out there. It's interesting to look at the different levels that we talked about in the fourfold human being, because, is it the brain really that makes choices in life? Is it the brain that's doing the cognitive activity? Well, on a certain level, the brain does make choices. That there's an intelligence to the brain and to the body. And the word intelligence actually literally means, intelligare means to choose between. To exercise intelligence means to choose between. And we see that the body is making choices, when to do this, how much to send there, so on and so forth. There is choice at the physical level. Even at the soul level, the astral body, the Ba, in the Egyptian sense, we're making choices, but those are generally based on our desires and personal proclivities, where it's like, well, I don't like going to art galleries, so no, I don't want to go. No. Or, yeah, I like candy, so let's go to the candy shop. These are based on what Steiner calls our sympathies and antipathies. You make choices based on what you like and what you don't like. It's very personal. It's really based on your desires or what you don't desire. But are you really in control when choices are made based on these personal proclivities and desires? Or are they running you? So this is why we need to look to an even higher level than the soul. We need to look to our spiritual nature, the ego, to be able to make choices that aren't based just on desires. When we get into the realm of moral choices, we really talk about our moral nature when we talk about the ego, to make choices that potentially go against our desires. This is not the brain. The brain doesn't think. The brain doesn't work at this level. The brain does not make moral choices. The brain doesn't come up with jokes and humor. These are beyond the physical and the metaphysical realms of our being. And we need to get this so we can exercise these parts of our being, because you are being presented, whether you know it or not, with moral choices all the time. That's part of life's training. Life is a schooling for the ego, for your spiritual nature. So pay attention to when you do your ruksha and you review your day and you go, wow, I was given a choice in that moment. Something was presented as a choice, or I was being tested the way Job was. How did I respond to that? So, yeah, making a choice in on the highest level of our being, which may take us into the realm of selfless acts, which is sort of a oxymoron to say it's a selfless act, but you actually have to be a self. You have to be a strong self in order to make a selfless act. You have to be a strong ego to do something that goes against your your desires and your proclivities. Uh, and that brings us to the last one we're going to cover tonight, which is ego as lover. Ego as lover. And what is love? I think of that song by one of my favorite bands, Boston. More than a feeling. Love is more than a feeling. I mean, it may have feelings with it, but that's the astral body. That's the soul nature, having feelings. But love is more than a feeling. What is it?
Choice.
Thank you. Oh, man. You get 2 gold stars. Love is a choice. Yeah, how did you come up with that?
It's faith background. That's what we're taught, that love is actually a choice.
Your faith background, your religious background. Right. Nice. Yeah, because that's what religion is trying to do, is trying to school the moral nature of the ego to make best choices, wisest choices, choices that aren't just based on your own self-interest, but on the collective interest. So you don't necessarily just fall into those kinds, into those types of relationships that are just easy and feel good, may not feel good, but you say, I'm making a choice to love this person and to serve this person and serve the greater good for the all. That takes a strong ego self to do that. Yeah, it's not dissolving the ego, it's dissolving egotism, which we'll talk about next week when we get into the diseases of the ego and the difference between ego and egotism and what that looks like. But yeah, the ego is the one that's the lover. You're not loving with your body. Yeah, you do, maybe. Not all the time. Sometimes you engage your body, in love making. And it's not necessarily just your energy, your ka, your pranic nature, in the Eastern teachings, you engage that in love making. But at the highest level, it may be no physical interaction, but just a choice that is with regards to the other person's freedom. That's a very high moral choice when what impels your choice is a respect for the other person's freedom, to uphold it, to serve it, to protect it.